so glad you guys are all here, and I love that it's a small class. So, I'm Deidre Blomquist, as I mentioned. I live in Monument with my husband and our son Jasper. You're going to learn a little bit more about him because he's the reason that we're doing all of this. He's 2.5 now. I am a functional nutritionist. I am a functional nutritional therapy practitioner and a master restorative wellness practitioner. When you hear nutritionist, I think it's really easy to think about food in particular, and in reality, what I do goes way beyond food. When you think about functional medicine, that tends to be more what I do, but I'm an unlicensed practitioner, which means that I get to work with people in a different way, focusing on diet, supplementation in a therapeutic way, as well as lifestyle changes. But we also get to use diagnostic tools like functional testing, which we're going to talk about a little bit. My practice is always growing nutrition, and I started my practice about 10 years ago. When I started, I was really focused on nutrition, teaching people to eat well, balanced meals, and as things progressed, they have changed. And so now Always Growing is basically split into two sides of the practice. We are fully virtual, so I work with 7 other practitioners, and we work with people all over the country. One side of the practice is women's health primarily, where we do digestive, hormonal, we focus on infertility a lot. We support women with pregnancy complications and through postpartum. And then the other side is pediatric health. And I never really thought I was going to get into the pediatric side of things, but when my son started having health issues, I already had the tools and resources to be able to help him. And so I wanted to come speak with you because you guys are on the front lines of things. If you see mothers and children who need this type of help, there are a lot of things that can happen first and foremost to get the ball rolling in the right direction. And then there might be need for further diagnostics to really figure out what's going on. But birth workers often see things happening in real time. And I just know you don't always have the tools to be able to support people. So that's what I'm hoping to provide for you today. Eczema is a huge epidemic, and 1 in 4 children typically will have some type of eczema before they turn 10 years old. There are almost 10 million children in America with some type of atopic dermatitis. And the one thing to keep in mind when we're talking about any type of skin condition, whether it's dermatitis or eczema or if it's acne, the diagnosis truly doesn't matter because we're still thinking about what's happening on the skin and what the root cause of that is, which we're going to talk about a little bit more. But eczema is a huge issue, not only in this country, but across the world. And there's not a whole lot of answers for it, unfortunately. So that's what we're going to discuss. This is my little boy, Jasper. When he was about 6 months old, he started developing a little spot of eczema right on his chest, and it grew and grew and grew. And we had no idea what was going on or what to do. And I started by seeing a naturopathic doctor and asked them what might be causing the dry patch. They didn't feel like there was a gut health issue by any means. They thought maybe he had a fatty acid deficiency. So they recommended that we start giving him something like cod liver oil, which can be incredibly therapeutic for skin health. But they also recommended that we do an infant probiotic because of his age. We started doing that and things drastically got worse. He was born at home. It was a vaginal birth, obviously. There was no reason why he should have had gut health issues, and so we were a little shocked by all of this, which is typically what I see parents thinking when they come in. And so we were kind of left stranded. We did what most people did. We went and saw his pediatrician. They said, I had a great pediatrician at that point in time, and she said, might be a gut health issue. Let's do some food allergy testing. He was 11 months old. We went and got blood drawn on him, which is super fun as a parent. And it came back with nothing. He wasn't allergic to anything, so we didn't have any answers. And so the next option was, well, we can send him to a dermatologist and we can give him a steroid cream or an oral steroid, and that will calm things down. And I didn't want to go that route. So I started using the tools that I have and that we work with adults and women to be able to resolve their gut health issues and a lot of skin health issues to see what we could do, and I'll share the story more later. So what causes eczema? In terms of conventional medicine, eczema is caused by if your environment is too hot or too cold. So you see a lot of kids who, in the summer months when they're really sweaty, they get eczema, or when it's really dry, especially here in Colorado, it's too cold, eczema flares up. What do we do? It's just the environment. They might have airborne allergies. That might be triggering some type of immune response that causes a flare-up to happen. But a lot of kids have allergies, so what do we do there? Do we just have them on something like Claritin or Benadryl all the time? If they're sweating too much, well, if you have children, you know it's very hard to keep them from running around and getting sweaty. So that's not really an easy answer. Stress or anxiety. Stress is a normal part of a child's developmental process, right? They have to undergo stressors, so we can't really avoid that, but we do want to be thinking about excessive stress. And maybe there's some type of topical irritant. And a lot of times this is where I see parents starting, is they're going through their laundry detergent, they're going through the lotions that they're putting on, and making sure that there's no irritant there. And this is absolutely crucial, but it's not the cause, typically, of what's happening with eczema. So from a conventional perspective, eczema is treated in a few key ways, and that's what you're left with. So if you're like me, you tried every topical on the market to figure out what's going on with the eczema, can't figure it out, nothing seems to work. Maybe you do allergy testing like I did. Oftentimes nothing's gonna come back, and if it doesn't, then what? Maybe we try steroid creams or immunosuppressants. And what these ultimately do is suppress the immune system so that you're no longer having that flare response, but it's not getting to the root cause of the issue. So the problem with steroid creams in particular, when we think about eczema, is that these are only approved for short-term use. If you look at the label and the warnings, they are approved for 2 weeks of use. And when we look at studies long-term, there are big changes to the HPA axis. HPA stands for hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And what this means is the brain communicates with our adrenal glands, and our adrenal glands are very important for regulating stress in the body. But the more important thing to keep in mind here is that our hormones don't work in a bubble. And so when we impact the adrenal glands, we're also impacting the thyroid and our sex hormones. So long-term, we are not setting up children for success by putting them on a steroid long-term that might be impacting their hormone health for the rest of their life and might take time to rebalance. So the problem with this approach is it does not address the root cause of what's actually causing the eczema in the first place. Skin health shines a light on the internal environment of the body. And this is, if nothing else, is the one big takeaway I want you to have today, because skin health is an outer reflection of what's happening internally. So we're going to go through some different root causes of eczema, and I can tell you that not all eczema cases are the same. We now work with a lot of children who have eczema. I can tell you that we have about a 90% success rate in completely resolving eczema. And we do it by looking at these areas in particular. So we're going to talk about poor drainage and detox today. We're going to talk about gut imbalances as well as food triggers. We're going to talk about an enzyme called DAO, which is important for the breakdown of histamine. And we're going to talk about mold and mycotoxins. One of the real issues with eczema, before we get into that, and this is kind of the real like deep-rooted cause that causes different issues in children, is the toxic burden that our children face today. The Environmental Working Group did a study where they looked at babies, 10 babies born in 2004, so this is a little bit older of a study, and it showed that in the umbilical cord blood, there were 287 chemicals. That's a lot of chemicals for a baby, right? So we're thinking about things like pesticides, herbicides, we're thinking about ingredients that come in personal care products, we're thinking about waste products from burning coal, gasoline, garbage, and that is like the tip of the iceberg, right? We're not thinking about metals, we're not thinking about mold with that as well. Children today are exposed to a lot of toxins. We all are. And so this creates huge dysfunction in the body, and the body will try to compensate in different ways, like we're going to discuss, in order to deal with this issue. So while yes, we want to think about reducing toxic burden for our children in our personal care items, our homes, the cleaning products we use, air quality, water quality, we also can see the downstream effects of that. Let's talk about drainage. So drainage is crucial for everybody. This is especially true for children. So this is a drainage funnel. And we're going to work from the bottom up because the bottom is the most important. If the bottom of the funnel is clogged, it makes it very difficult for the upper tiers to work. So at the bottom, you're going to see the colon. We're going to talk about colon health and gut health a lot today because if the colon is not functioning well, it makes it very difficult for the rest of the body to function well. So when we think about things like constipation, Constipation is incredibly common. It is not normal. Everybody, babies included, should be having at least a bowel movement a day. And if they are not, you are constipated. Then we see the liver and bile ducts. Our liver is an organ that we cannot live without. It detoxifies our blood several times a day. It conjugates to different toxins, both the toxins that we come in contact with through our external worlds, as well as the toxins that our body creates on its own, like hormones, for instance. It needs to remove those things from the system, and it does that via the colon. Now, if this section of the drainage funnel is in trouble and not working well, what happens is the body essentially tries to pull the emergency brake. And if it's not working, you can see that first one there is the skin. If your body's not able to drain toxins through the liver and the colon, it will push it out through the skin in order to remove it. This is a safety mechanism. It's not the most pleasant safety mechanism, but our body doesn't want these toxins recirculating because it causes damage to our cells, and it will get rid of it by any means necessary. So one of the things we need to focus on is what is happening in these two bottom tiers of the drainage funnel and supporting those. So there's a couple of ways that we can do that, and this is important when we think about children as well as breastfeeding mothers. So in children, I'm thinking about babies and young children. Under 2 years old is kind of where we're going with this. We need to make sure that constipation is resolved. For little babies, we can think about topical magnesium. Earthly has a really great clean product that has magnesium. It can be rubbed on their stomach, on their feet, their legs. That can be really helpful for getting things moving. We can also be thinking about magnesium oxide taken orally. Magnesium oxide is typically what I recommend instead of magnesium citrate for little ones. And the reason is because magnesium citrate changes the way that water balances in the colon and can actually leave water in the colon rather than it being reabsorbed normally and cause diarrhea. So then we end up making children very dehydrated in the process. Magnesium oxide doesn't do that. It will stimulate motility and acts as a laxative, but will not dehydrate little ones. Other products I really love is one called BioRay NDF Pooper. This is an herbal tincture. What it does is stimulate the colon to have a bowel movement, so that can be used short term as needed to get things moving. The other thing that we can do for little ones is what we call ILU massage. So it's literally like it sounds, massaging their stomach like an I, an L, and a U, just to get things moving from a mechanical standpoint. We can also support the liver. BioRay also makes a product called NDF Calm. This is specifically for the liver. So these are low-dose herbs that can support liver drainage and bile production. If they are eating solids, we can also be thinking about foods that support liver function. Things like egg yolks contain a good amount of choline. Beef liver, whether we're doing it raw, if we're cooking it and putting it in things like meatloaf or meatballs for them, that's a great way to sneak it in. But we can also do things like desiccated or dried beef liver and just sprinkle it into smoothies or like a little bit of applesauce and scoot it right in. Beef liver works really nicely on the liver because it contains a lot of nutrients to support liver, but it's kind of this theory of like heals like. It contains the nutrients that a liver needs to function, but also kind of serves as a superfood for the liver. Yep. See if I can go back. Come back up. Okay. We also want to think about root veggies. Cooking them very well for root veggies can be really helpful. The fiber is going to help with constipation, but it also helps bind to toxins to support liver function. Now, as far as breastfeeding mothers go, breastfeeding mothers are just as important, especially when we're thinking about young children. If mom is constipated, she is recirculating toxins. And we often forget that breast milk is a drainage pathway. So we know, if mom drinks alcohol, it's likely going to pass through the breast milk. The same thing is happening with all toxins in the body. So we need to make sure that there is an elimination route via the colon for those toxins to be released on a regular basis. Otherwise, it will go through the breast milk. We can also do magnesium oxide for mother orally if she's constipated. Here we can focus on hydration, making sure that she's drinking at least half of her body weight in ounces, if not more, depending on where she's at in the breastfeeding journey, but also utilizing electrolytes. Most people are drinking enough water, but they are not putting any electrolytes in their water, and this makes it very difficult to be cellularly hydrated. Things like Ultima, Element, even just doing like trace minerals. You can find a lot of these things in health food stores to put into your water to help with hydration status. We can also bring in things like making sure she has adequate fiber in her diet, using prunes, kiwi, beets. All of these things are going to support constipation, and beets supports liver function as well. Mom may need additional liver support, but we don't want to detox mom in any way, shape, or form, which is why we never do many herbs during breastfeeding. But there are different ways that mom can support liver function. A lot of those are going to look just like those food recommendations, getting lots of choline, beef liver, root vegetables. She could do raw carrots, for instance. That helps support liver function. Those are the ways that we want to support mom while she's breastfeeding for liver detox. Then we want to assess gut health. So gut health is huge for children, and it's a big contributing factor when it comes to eczema. So here are some signs that there is a problem with gut health in children and in breastfeeding mothers. So for children, like we've talked about, constipation is huge. It might also be diarrhea. So if they're having loose, watery bowel movements, especially if they have started solids, that's a problem. If they have frequent diaper rashes that are unexplained, it's not that they are sitting in their diaper for too long, doesn't make sense, that can be a sign of a gut health issue. Colic is another big one. Colic is kind of a diagnosis that's provided to fussy children. Oftentimes there's a gut health issue, they're gassy, they're bloated, they're uncomfortable, and the only way that they know how to communicate is from crying. We also want to look at skin rashes, of course. This will include eczema, but also baby acne. I see a lot of babies that have really red cheeks as well. White-coated tongues or redness around the mouth can be a sign of a gut health issue, and of course, gas and fussiness. Now, for breastfeeding mothers, it looks somewhat similar, but there's some nuance here. They might have constipation or diarrhea. Women usually know which way they lean. We want it to be right in the middle where it's happening at least once a day, not too loose. If they have bloating or gas, most people have some type of bloating or gas. It's very, very common, not normal, especially gas that smells particularly bad. That is a sign of something going on with gut health. If they have heartburn, heartburn is a different thing when we're thinking about pregnancy in particular, but if somebody has heartburn or reflux postpartum, that's a sign that there's a gut health issue. If they have thrush around their nipples, that's a sign of a yeast overgrowth in the body. We can also be looking for signs of recurring plugged ducts, things like mastitis, even mood disorders in breastfeeding mothers can be a sign of gut health because most of the serotonin in our body is produced in the gut. And serotonin is one of our neurotransmitters that makes us feel good. So if that's not being produced at the appropriate rates in the GI tract, we can have mood disorders. Now, we can also screen gut health using diagnostic tools. So the one that I like to use is called the GI map. This is a one-time stool test, and it looks at a number of different things in the gut to include normal bacteria and then opportunistic pathogens, which we're going to talk about. These are actually Jasper's results that I ran on him the first time that I did a stool test. So these are our good gut bacteria. We want them to be in good levels. We don't want them to be high, like you can see here. Sometimes they look really low, and when they're really low, it means that opportunistic pathogens can start to overgrow and crowd out the good bacteria. Now, when they are high, that tells me that as a whole, there is a bacterial overgrowth happening. Some of you may know this known as SIBO, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Bacteria is not supposed to live in the small intestine. It's supposed to live in the large intestine or the colon, but when it moves into the small intestine, it causes really bad bloating, distension of the abdomen, lots of pain typically. We can also screen for opportunistic pathogens. So here you can see the report where it's looking at the opportunistic bacteria and potential autoimmune triggers. These are all bacteria. So again, we don't want to see a whole lot of these coming up red like they are. That tells me that they are way too high. These different bacteria can produce a lot of different things in the body, but the biggest thing is these bacteria themselves produce toxins that can cause inflammation and a lot of other symptoms. This test also screens for things like yeast and fungal infections. It screens for parasites. It also looks at secretory IgA, which is a sign of gut immune health. And if it is too high or too low, I can tell you his was through the roof. It also screens for calprotectin. Calprotectin is basically the conventional measure for looking at IBD or IBS. That tells us what level of inflammation is happening in the colon. His markers on this test were also maxed out, the highest I have ever seen on adult or child. And we can screen for something called steatocrit, which tells us if there is any fatty acid in the stool. It tells me that if he might not be producing enough bile, maybe he's not chemically digesting fatty acids, or I'm not chemically digesting fatty acids. And if that's happening, it becomes toxic in the colon as well. The one thing I do want to mention here is that this tool is not foolproof. by any means. So parasites are something that we talk a lot about in our practice because parasites are incredibly common here in the US and people don't often realize this. And so anytime I see a bacterial overgrowth like this, I'm always thinking about parasites. Parasites can carry bacteria into other parts of the body, to include the small intestine. And so one of the things that we did as part of Jasper's gut healing, in addition to bringing these bacteria down using a broad spectrum antimicrobial, is we also did parasite eradication. And I can tell you that I pulled parasites out of his stool like 4 inches long, right? And part of that has to do with the gut health of mother. So I don't have any gut health issues that I'm aware of. I also eat a lot of sushi. I've never done any parasite eradication prior to becoming pregnant. I didn't know all of this information before I had him. And so one of the things that I wanted to make sure that we screened him for and did some work on him is to remove those pathogens in the body that are normal. We all have them. We have co-evolved with them. They're a normal part of our gut microbiome. But when they start to overgrow, they can cause big issues. Removing parasites was one of the huge things that transformed his health. I gave him anti-parasitic herbs, and 12 hours later, he passed that 4-inch worm, and things drastically changed for him, which I'll show you more. He was 11 months old at that point. Yeah. I also wanted to point out a couple of these bacteria that are here because, as I mentioned, they produce toxins. So Staphylococcus and Streptococcus are normal bacteria in the gut microbiome, but when they are high, they can produce toxins that create inflammation. Sometimes this looks like diarrhea, but it didn't for Jasper. He was actually constipated. So that was a big piece of his drainage funnel, right? Everything was backed up. We were recirculating everything. But if you look down here under the potential autoimmune triggers essentially means that research shows that these bacteria are related to autoimmune conditions, not that they are foreshadowing or like if they come back, you have an autoimmune condition. But Klebsiella species in particular releases histamine into the body. And this is very important because many children who have eczema are very itchy, and itchy skin is a sign of histamine intolerance or overload. Now, if you have bacteria that are in the gut that are also releasing histamine, you can do everything you need to as far as reducing histamine in the diet, which we're going to talk about. But if your body's already pumping it out internally, it makes it very hard to get ahead of. So it's very important to screen for these things and see what's there so that we can rebalance the gut to bring homeostasis back to where we would like for it to be. I never recommend supplementing with probiotics for children blindly. I'm a stickler about this. And one of the reasons is because when I went to see that naturopathic doctor, she recommended that we take a probiotic. Well, the probiotic that she gave us had histamine producing strains in it. It made things so much worse. And so I never give children a probiotic without assessing their gut health first. Because in many states, their beneficial bacteria are already in a good spot. If they're low, that's a time for doing some probiotics. But we also want to know, do they already have a histamine issue? If we give them a histamine-producing probiotic, it might make things worse. They might need something else that doesn't produce histamine to repopulate the gut with that good bacteria without harming anything in the process. And on the same kind of token, if we would have given Jasper a probiotic with his beneficial bacteria being so high in the first place, he doesn't need anymore. We don't need to put that in place for him. So doing this blindly is something that I see a lot of practitioners doing and not something I recommend. So I know it's very tempting for new moms to say like, hey, I think there's a gut health issue, let's do a probiotic. It's not typically going to serve them in the long run. So assessing first can be really helpful. Now let's talk about food a little bit. Food is not the problem, but it can be a trigger. When you think about kids with eczema, there's typically some type of food trigger that is involved, but it doesn't always mean that they are having an allergic reaction to food. So like I had mentioned, we went and did allergy testing, nothing came back. What the hell do we do now, right? So I wanted to explain this concept of intestinal permeability for you because this is very important for children and how this relates back to gut health. So under normal conditions, the small intestine looks like this. There's villi in the gut. They should be very close together, kind of like shag carpet when it's brand new. Under normal conditions, what happens is food is chemically digested at the appropriate rate, and the small intestine mucosa gets to decide what goes into the bloodstream. It gets to say, hey, food has been digested properly, now it comes back in. But when there are pathogens in the gut, it causes inflammation and causes these villi to break down over time. So they look more like this, which means that they get to be a whole lot less selective about what's going directly into the bloodstream. Over time, what can happen is food particles come along, and whether it's chemically digested properly or not, goes directly into the bloodstream, and the immune system essentially treats this like a foreign invader. We need to go attack it, we're gonna mount a response. So what you might see, and this is true for adults as well, is that children will start to develop food sensitivities, where like something new bothers their stomach, and then it's something else, and pretty soon there's like a short list of foods they can safely eat. And the reason is because of this intestinal permeability, and when we remove what's causing the inflammation in the first place, we can bring those foods back into place safely. So while removing foods might be part of the equation to start with, here's what I typically recommend doing in terms of an elimination diet for mom and child to start with, just to see if we can get rid of any of those big players. So we're thinking about gluten, which is a hard one. We need to make sure that we're removing all gluten fully, and I typically recommend doing this for a month, which is a long time, but it is something that is very important. One of the things that we often don't realize about gluten is conventional wheat is sprayed with a pesticide called glyphosate. Glyphosate in and of itself causes that intestinal permeability. So we need to make sure that we're removing that for mom and children if possible. Dairy is also another big one. Not a lot of people can tolerate dairy. I will also tell you that people with parasitic infections don't produce enough lactase to break down the lactose in dairy appropriately, so that's part of the digestion issue. Soy is also sprayed with a lot of glyphosate. Corn as well. We want to remove nuts and we want to remove whole eggs. It like kills my soul to say like take eggs out, but they have very big reactions for some people. So it is worth trying to see if it helps. Another caveat here is nightshades and histamine rich and producing foods is another thing to consider. It's not usually where I start, but it can be helpful. Doing a low histamine diet is a big challenge. I have done that diet. Not a fun time for anybody. There's a lot of really healthy, great foods that are in there. But if you have a child who is struggling with histamine, it can be very helpful to remove those things temporarily while assessing what's happening with gut health to see if we can lower the bucket from filling too fast in terms of histamine. Now, if all of that sounds very stressful, which it often is, we can also do food sensitivity testing. Food sensitivity testing is a little bit different than food allergy testing. So the test that we use is one called the MRT. It stands for Mediator Release Test. This tests 176 different foods and food chemicals, so this is a very small portion of the test results, and it is a blood draw. Now, I like to do this on mom if she is breastfeeding over baby or child whenever possible. There are times if a child has been eating solids for a period of time and then they develop eczema that it can be helpful to do the blood draw on them directly. I try to do things as least invasively as possible because doing blood draws on little ones is not something anybody wants to do. And oftentimes I do see that the eczema starts while breastfeeding is in place or while the formula is in place. Okay, so regardless of those two scenarios, we can get a lot of information about what's happening in the body, but when possible, I like to do this on mom. So this is exactly what this test is. This is my MRT test that I did at that point in time to help Jasper out. You can kind of see a couple of things that came up here. Egg yolks, but not egg whites. It's always interesting. So I just took egg yolks out. That helped a ton. The other big thing that came up for us was tomato. Now the thing I can tell you is that in my body, those are things that I eat all the time and I have no reaction. So why is he having a reaction to those things? One of the things we typically accept is that when a baby gets sick, they're breastfeeding, the saliva transfer with mom's breast makes mom's body to produce different antibodies and immune response to things, right? The same thing is happening even if we don't realize it. So if I'm inadvertently having an immune response to something that I don't recognize or doesn't hurt my body in any way, shape, or form, I'm still passing that immune reaction via breast milk. So that overloads his system as well. The other thing I will say is that there is a huge amount of genetic variation that happens with our children, right? So me and my husband, we mush our genetics together. It means that I might have histamine intolerance and not tolerate these things very well, and my husband might tolerate histamines just fine, but he has really bad detox pathways, or he's like more susceptible to inflammation. And in Jasper, that looks like eczema, even though neither one of us have these issues, right? So there's often a time where mom or dad have eczema and then children do. Not always the case. So Just keep that part in mind. But the reason I like this food sensitivity testing is it gives us very specific answers about what needs to be removed. And the goal isn't to remove things long term, it's to remove them short term. So I can tell you that we removed things for about 6 months and then we brought them back. He can tolerate tomato, he can tolerate egg yolks. There's no problem anymore because we fixed what's happening in the gut while we took that inflammatory response off of his system. Now we're going to talk about DAO enzymes. So DAO is diamine oxidase. This is a digestive enzyme, and it's responsible for the breakdown of histamine in the body. So if you have an inability to produce adequate levels of DAO, it makes it really hard for you to break down histamine in foods that you come in contact with, and it creates an immune response in the gut and in the body as a whole. Usually this looks like some type of skin issue, so eczema, hives, psoriasis, itchy skin. But it can also look like food allergens. Maybe you get swelling or redness around the eyes, runny nose, itchy, trouble sleeping at night. Histamine issues are worse at night for people. So typically with children, you'll find children who just don't sleep very well. They have trouble falling asleep. They're waking up itchy. That is a histamine breakdown issue. There's a lot of different ways that we can support this. So first things first, as I mentioned, we want to at least reduce histamine-rich food intake. Doesn't have to be 0, but we want to stop filling the bucket too fast because the body's having trouble breaking it down in the first place. Then from there, we want to think about supporting DAO enzyme capacity and level in the body. One of my favorite ways to do this is with grass-fed organs, liver and kidney in particular. I mentioned doing grass-fed beef liver before. You can do this raw, you can get it in capsule form. Great way to do that. Even more potent in DAO is kidney. There's a product from Perfect Supplements called multi-organ. Sometimes you can find desiccated kidney by itself, or you can get this from a local farmer. You don't have to do a lot of it. It's very potent, but it contains a lot of DAO, and it's very nutrient dense. So this is something that we can do long-term to support children. Then, as I mentioned, we want to make sure that there's no histamine-producing probiotics in place. These are the strains that you're looking for on the back of a probiotic to tell you that there is a histamine-producing strain. The one that I want to point out is that first one, Lactobacillus reuteri. This is very, very common. It's a very important strain for children who have gone through C-section, where they might not have had that inoculation of the bacteria from mom's vaginal canal via birth. This can be very important. It is often very low, but it also does produce histamine. So this is kind of where it comes in, where it's not the same for every child. We have to think clinically about what's happening for the child. Does it make sense to have this? If they don't respond well to it, pull them off of it. Here are some of my favorite probiotics that do not contain histamine. Seeking Health makes some great products. One's called Histamine X and Histamine Block. They also make a probiotic called Probiota Histamine X, I believe, and that has the probiotic strains in it. Quercetin can also be incredibly soothing for histamine reactions in the body. And many children also get some type of lung involvement as a result of histamine intolerance or overload. Perilla is an herb that can be incredibly helpful for that. I see it work well for a lot of children who have asthma-like symptoms as well. Oh, there we go again. And then lastly, I want to talk about mold and mycotoxins because I don't think enough people are talking about this or are aware of this as an issue. So mold is what we think of it as. Mold is like the thing that you can physically see. Mold produces something called mycotoxins, and these are poisonous substances that we typically inhale. We can also come in contact with them when we touch molds, but it's estimated that 70% of homes have mold in them, and it's not just older homes. New homes are probably worse offenders, in my opinion, and the reason is because they do not have airflow the way that nature intended it to, right? Mold's normal. Mold's part of nature, but nature has these mechanisms to keep it in check, like sunshine to kill it, and fresh airflow to make sure that the mycotoxins that they produce are circulating in very small levels and then no big deal. But in our homes, when they are airtight and we're not getting outside and we don't have good air filtration and we're not opening the windows, for instance, that air recirculates and we start breathing in those mycotoxins on a regular basis. Now, typically what happens is children are the canary in the coal mine, which means that their small little bodies respond a lot faster to toxic burden. And when they're breathing these things in, it accumulates in their body much faster than it does for us. So it's not uncommon to see families where only one child is sick, but maybe not the whole family, or maybe only mom is sick. One of the patterns that we typically see is that the first child is the sickest. This isn't always the case, but there is a trend there. And the reason is because the first child gets a lot of the detoxification from mom via birth, right? So all of mom's toxic burden gets passed to that first child. All of their metals, if they have mold exposure, all of the chemicals in their system that they maybe didn't get rid of prior to birth, which is a big part of what we do and why we work with a lot of women in the preconception phase, to do that detoxification so we're not passing that burden on to our children. They tend to get the sickest. And then they come in contact with something like mycotoxins, and it just puts them right over the edge. Okay? So let's talk about some symptoms of mold toxicity in babies and young children in particular. Constipation is typically what happens. The reason this happens is because mycotoxins are a neurotoxin, and they change the way that the brain communicates with the GI tract and slows down motility. Sometimes they have diarrhea, not always. They might also have stomach pain. So a lot of times young children say, like, my stomach hurts. And it's like, I have no idea why your stomach might hurt, but maybe there's something going on there. I also see a lot of nosebleeds in children when there's a mold issue. Because of the way that mold mycotoxins are inhaled, it tends to impact the respiratory tract. We see a lot of asthma-like symptoms. If I were to pull up two lists and show you asthma symptoms and mold symptoms, they would look scarily similar. We get a lot of coughing, but not always. Sometimes there's purple or red rings around the eyes of the children. They have sinus congestion, some type of postnasal drip. These are your kids, like, always a runny nose. Little babies can't breathe through their nose properly. Maybe they have baby acne. They're frequently sick. They have some type of rash, ear infections, ear pain, colic again, cradle crap, and thrush. These are very common fungal infections, but we don't typically see them like that. So sometimes doing something like olive oil or coconut oil and brushing it very gently will get rid of it. If it comes back again and again, that's a fungal issue. Acidic poops in babies and young toddlers. So if they are getting rashes that don't make sense and mom's like, oh, they just had a little bit more acid in their diet, or it must have been something they ate, typically it's a mold issue. And sometimes they get reflux or silent reflux in babies. So if you can't set them down on their back, they're having trouble. This kind of relates back to colic. If mom is really struggling because baby has some type of digestive issue, I always want to screen for mold. Now, healing from mold is multifaceted. It is very complex. So removing the environmental exposure is huge. If we know that there's mold in the home, we need to section it off. Proper remediation, replacing those damaged materials is huge. I never recommend that families go in and like try to kill the mold themselves with like bleach or vinegar or anything like that, because when we disturb mold, it releases more of those mycotoxins, right? So we need to make sure that we get it taken care of appropriately, and that in and of itself makes mold very challenging to get rid of. Finding it is typically the hardest part though. We can also make sure that we're supporting drainage and impaired organ function. So how do we support the skin? Maybe we're doing something like fatty acids, cod liver oil. Maybe we're making sure we're supporting constipation. Can we support the liver in children? And then from there, we can bind to specific mycotoxins. So one of the things we can do is urine testing on children as well as adults for mycotoxins in the urine that are being excreted. It's really non-invasive. It's a little more challenging on little children, but we can typically see what type of mycotoxins they're excreting. And when we know exactly what it is, we can select binders to pull it out of the system more effectively. In kids, we can also use antifungals to kill the mold that might be proliferating in the body and growing. Now, keep in mind that mold needs two things to grow, and our bodies are perfect environments: dark places and humidity, right? Sinuses, GI tract, dark and wet, right? So we know that these things can overgrow in the body, and they are intended to do so, and so we need to go in and kill those things in a really gentle way. And then from there, what we can do is heal the microbiome, make sure that any impacted cells, the liver, kidneys, brain, are healed, and we're bringing in nutrients to be supportive of that as well. This is very, very complicated, and so I didn't want to give you like, hey, here's exactly what to do, but it is something to be aware of because it's a huge factor, and it's something that is coming up more and more. But typically what happens is we build a diet program, lifestyle, thinking about air quality, water quality, what are the things that they can do at home to help support detoxification, and then do supplementation to rebalance the system. So now I want to give you the end of Jasper's story. I showed you that picture earlier of his skin. This is 1 month later. Drastically better. He doesn't have any more rashes. He's had one flare-up in the last year and a half. We ate way too much tomato way too quickly. And he doesn't have any more reactions to food. So normally what happens is we don't have any reaction to any food. This was like a weird week where we had like ketchup every day and like spaghetti every night sort of thing. It was like a really weird reaction fluke. We haven't had any issues prior to that. He used to be really constipated where he was maybe going like once a week. Now it's an everyday situation, so much better in terms of toxic burden. He doesn't have any ongoing supplementation that we're doing. So we're not doing anything on a regular basis to keep things in a good spot. And I don't have any big fear of immune challenges coming up. And this is really crucial because one of the things that we need to be aware of with children who have gut health issues is it can turn into something bigger. Autoimmune conditions are a huge issue in our country, and they don't typically come as like one autoimmune condition. It's usually like 2 or 3 in the same person, right? And so I don't have to worry about this getting into something bigger because of some type of immune dysregulation in his body because we've rebalanced this very early on. The other thing that I will say about children is they are so resilient. Children are a lot easier to work with as clients because they bounce back so quickly. They have really fast results with things. Their bodies haven't taken as much burden as ours do as adults, and they tend to respond very quickly and have